and the moon into blood. And I wonder, real, literal blood? But the context of this, of course, is judgmental language. Sometimes blood doesn't mean blood because the Bible tells us blood doesn't mean blood. The same thing in verse 29 of Matthew chapter 24. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven. That's a direct quotation from Isaiah chapter 13, which is describing the destruction of Babylon of the Old Testament. And all dispensational commentators I looked up applied the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light and the stars will fall from heaven as typical judgmental language used in the Old Testament. This is dispensational scholars saying that. And we have other clues as well. Genesis chapter 37. Joseph has this dream of sun, moon, and stars bowing down to him, obviously representing Israel. And even dispensational scholars will say sun, moon, and stars represent Israel. You get to Revelation chapter 12. What do you find? A woman clothed with the sun, standing on the moon, stars are dressed on her head. Is this a literal woman that big? Absolutely not. It's a depiction of Israel. Even Tim LaHaye, in his commentary on Revelation, says this is a depiction of Israel. So why is it when we get to Matthew chapter 24, verse 29, where similar language is used, in fact a direct quotation from Isaiah chapter 13, that all of a sudden the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, have to be literal, when in fact that's not the way they're used in other contexts, in the very context. Remember, Tommy talks about context, in the very context that this passage is taken.
Yeah, once again, Gary goes wandering off, but interestingly enough, Gary Demar in an audio lecture on the 70th week of Daniel said the following about analogy in relationship to his Acts 2 thing. He says the Bible often teaches by analogy. It goes back and it puts out something from another place where it is very clear. This is going to be just like that, Gary said. So what do you have to do? Anytime that someone teaches by analogy, what do you have to do? You have to know the premise of the analogy. You have to go back to the analogy and try to figure out what the characteristics are like. If I do not know the characteristics of the earlier thing, then I'm going to be able to interpret the later thing. And that's what my interpretation of Acts 2 is all about. Is this is that refers to the question they ask, are these men drunk? He said, no, this is that which was spoken of the prophet. In other words, it's the Holy Spirit. He's making an analogy between what happened in Joel 2 and Acts 2. And apparently Gary understands that concept, but he doesn't want to apply it, in other situations. Okay, now my question.
No, he the question.
That's right. You question. That's right.
Mr. Demar.
It's interesting that Stanley Toussaint, who Tommy quotes quite often, who's a fellow dispensationalist, on the Acts passage dealing with this is like that, and he specifically says it does not say this is like that, and it does not mean this is like that. So when again, you have to understand the context in which Tommy is dealing with this. Here's my question. It's a 5-parter. Okay. And it's real simple. And I put it up here. Let me just do this real quick here.
I can see that real well.
Show me a New Testament verse that states that the temple will be rebuilt because your system demands a rebuilt temple in order for it to be destroyed again. Show me a New Testament verse that states there will be a 7-year tribulation period because you maintain that the Great Tribulation is 7 years and that the book of Revelation is about that as well as Matthew chapter 24. A New Testament verse that states that Antichrist will make a covenant with the Jews because that is again part of your Great Tribulation scenario. A New Testament verse that states that the Antichrist will break a covenant with the Jews because that's part of the process as well. And a New Testament verse that states that the church will be raptured prior to a period of 7 years. Now, what I want are specific verses that actually state these things because these are the kind of the key elements of your system. So could you give me the 5 verses that go with these questions?
A New Testament verse that states the temple will be rebuilt is Matthew 24:15. It states through implication, since the abomination of desolation must take place in the Holy of Holies, then there has to be a rebuilt temple there. And so I would argue that it states that through implication. Also, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 talks about the Antichrist setting up his image in the temple of God. I think that's about verse 4. And that clearly implies. So if these are, the crux is, if these are future verses, in other words, if Matthew 24:15, for example, where Christ is speaking is a reference to a future event, then there has to be a future temple because it's clearly referring to that. And since I would argue that all of Matthew 24 for contextual reasons and broader reasons refers to such future. Same with 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 because that is a summary of Old Testament teaching in the New Testament about the tribulation and the career of the Antichrist. He has a tutore of names, a lot of different names. He's the beast, he's the Antichrist, he's the man of lawlessness, the man of sin. And he is going to set up his image in a temple, and that implies that it's going to be rebuilt. Not only has Israel, by the way, come back into the land, which many people said would not happen who didn't believe in the future for Israel, but there's a growing temple movement in Israel. And I'm not saying that proves anything yet, but I'm simply saying that there's a whole lot of Orthodox Jews over in Israel who are working really hard to try to rebuild the temple. Could you put the questions back up so I can know what they are? I don't even know what the second one is. Okay, a New Testament verse that states there will be a 7-year tribulation period. The 3.5-year references in Revelation chapter 11 come from the book of Daniel. And we know from Daniel 9:26, I believe, that something's going to happen in the middle of the 70th week, which is a 7-year period. And so you have established in the book of Daniel, chapter 7 and chapter 9, 3.5-year period of 1,260 days, 42 months, etc. And therefore, when you look in the context of Revelation chapter 11, one of the references to 3.5 years refers to the first half of the tribulation, and another reference in Revelation chapter 11 refers to the second half. And so, even though I wasn't homeschooled, I know that 3.5 plus 3.5 equals 7. And so the basis is, do these refer to two halves, added together?
The answer's been raptured, so.
Thank you.
Mr. Demar, you have a minute to comment.
All right. First point, a New Testament verse that states that the temple will be rebuilt. Tommy Ice and Randall Price admitted in their book on the temple that there is no New Testament verse that says that the temple will be rebuilt. Now, he has to go back to work out Daniel chapter 9, etc., but there is no New Testament verse that says the temple is going to be rebuilt. The Old Testament talks about a rebuilt temple, and there was a rebuilt temple. Jesus was in a rebuilt temple. It was that rebuilt temple that was destroyed in AD 70. What the dispensationalist has to maintain is that there's going to be another rebuilt temple, and you would expect, if the New Testament is going to talk about that, it would mention it. It does not. Using Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, about the abomination of desolation, what does it say? It says, when you see the abomination of desolation. We're back to audience context again. Tommy hasn't demonstrated why it shifts from verse 4 to that contemporary audience to a new audience, the you is. If Jesus wanted to use a future audience, all he had to do was say, them.
Dr. Rice, to Mr. Demar.
Okay.
2 minutes.
We say there's no verse that says it in that way, but the Bible teaches it, as I explained earlier, by saying that there's going to be an abomination of desolation which has to take place in the Holy of Holies. And so if that is future, as I said, then the Bible teaches it. Gary, how do you justify your metaphorical interpretation of Zechariah 14:4 when the controlling context of that verse refers to a literal, major geophysical event in the days of King Uzziah? Zechariah 14:4 says, in that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is in front of Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives will be split in its middle from east to west by a very large valley, so that half of the mountain will move toward the north and the other half to the south. Now, I heard Gary say one time the second coming is not even mentioned in this verse, so I threw in verse 5, which is the continuation of verse 4. It says, and you will flee by the valley of my mountain, for the valley of the mountains will reach to Azel. Yes, you will flee just as you fled before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. then the Lord will, my God will come, and all the holy ones with him.